met to lots of people, already influenced by the way the British were planning to separate Singapore from Malaya. Then the next generation is when they came together again, however briefly. What was the thinking behind that? And to actually shape the minds of people to want to become one again under the Federation of Malaysia, which is a totally new concept. That must have a different impact on what might be called another generation of Singaporeans. For Singaporeans to get into the post-1963 or again post-1965 generation, the last 10 years of the Socialist Club, as it were, belongs to, seem to be a different generation. So I just wondered whether that might be thrown in as well as part of the discourse.
Prof, can I just kind of put you on the spot a moment? Assuming that there are different Fajar generations, in which one would you like place yourself?
I would belong to the first one. Very simply. Because I grew up in the context of the Straits Settlements, the Federated Malay States, and the other Malay states, and only just beginning to, in the post-1945, to think about the possibility of one Malaya, which included both, but recognizing that the British were out to separate Singapore from Malaya. And to the extent that we as students already were conscious of the fact that all of us who spent time together on the campus and lived there as resident students, were almost all of us from Malaya, from Federation of Malaya. The Singapore students weren't allowed to stay in the hostels. A few Singapore students who received scholarships were forced to stay in, but they were hardly there because they were home. They had their homes and they went home. And the bulk of the Singapore students, there were not that many of them anyway. I think less than a third of the students were Singaporeans. 2/3 of them were from Malaya. So even in the University of Malaya, already, I'm not sure we're talking about the same generation here, already elements of differentiation, simply by the way we lived, the way we talked to one another, and the way we thought about the future. Because all those 2/3 of those who came from the Malay states were primarily concerned with Malaya and didn't actually have any understanding of Singapore. And I had a feeling, at least even at the time, that most of the Singapore students I knew didn't really care much for the rest of Malaya.
Thank you, Prof.
Sumi, would you want to take the question?
Thanks, Prof, for speaking so off the cuff and very sort of evocative, useful for me to think about. The interesting thing about the plans that the British made, the educational plans that they made, as the document that talks about long-term planning for education suggests, they are sort of, when the British formulated the educational plans, they actually thought of Malayan Union together with Singapore. So it was an attempt for them to, well, separate out Singapore, but then the inclusion of Singapore in a putative Malayan nation was one of the objectives. I mean, don't know how long, but eventually the British too think that Singapore will become part of Malaya, and the educational plans were meant to make sure that that happens. So this emphasis on English, for instance, right, was one of the ways that they hope to bring about this future convergence. But as all of us know, the Malayan Union sort of did not really happen. It was replaced by the Federation. And because of that replacement, because of this strong reaction from the Malay nationalists, from UMNO, that plan was scuttled. In fact, the 10-year plan that I talked about, it was sort of formulated in close conjunction with the educational plan for the Malayan Union. But when Malayan Union did not happen or could not be sustained, right, the British did not in any way jump the 10-year plan. So interestingly, you could think about this as the British post-war plan to play Malayan nationalists being sustained in Singapore, but not in the Federation. I think that is one of the interesting points which I realized when I was going through the documents, that actually the British had a field day playing Malayan nationalists in Singapore, but not so much in Federation. As for whether the, I think that when I brought up the point on how do we understand, who do we include by Fajar Generation, I was sort of also pushed to imply that perhaps by talking about Mr. Koh's account, it was quite different from the your generation or the 50s generation, so that we might perhaps talk about different Fajar generations, but yet sustaining or tracing from a same, same genealogy, as it were. Yeah, but that definitely is worth examination.
Rocco?
Thank you to the panelists. That was really illuminating, and I learned quite a bit too, particularly Dr. Sai's piece, because I've been interested in English and identity in Singapore, and hence in the education system, and I've been relying on Yeo Kim Hwa quite a lot, right? And he did point out, and you made it very clear, the continuity of educational policies from colonial to the current. Right, but my main point I'm standing here is I agree. I'm so glad that Professor Wang brought up this point, that the Fajar generation, that did not seem to me to apply to the 60s. Now, I was of the generation of the 60s, right, and we never thought of Fajar as but history. Let me put my own self in context. I'm a year KU junior. In that sense, I went up to university in the time when he was in his second year and I was in my first year, right? So that puts it into, and by the time we came up to university, we had not really very conscious about Fajar generation and all that. And by the way, while I have the phone, I might as well make some corrections. He wrongly describes me as president of the DSC. Actually, I only became active in 1965. In my second year, 65, 66, the university calendars, academic years are like that. And that year was the year he graduated. So I hardly knew him or even heard of him when I was in campus. The people I heard of were Raymond Ong and Chan Kian, who were my contemporaries. And in fact, as he himself actually said, to my surprise, in his piece, in the 1960s already saw the visible decline, those are his words, of the Socialist Club. By the time we came up to university, there was no more Fajar. I think it had been closed down. 1963, you must remember, was Operation Cold Storm. And among those who were detained were Socialist Club members, right? And Dr. Sai is very right. When we went up to university, 1964 was the year when the Certificate of Suitability was introduced, right? And this, which was, and to the dismay of the whole university community. For those of you who may not know about it, it means every university student who applied for admission to the university had to have his or her record cleared by the internal security, and therefore you were deemed politically clean. So I presume that all those Socialist Club members who went up to university got their suitability certificates if they were after 1964. And in fact, we, the Democratic Socialist Club, in the very inaugural journal of ours, Demos, protested against the other thing I want to point out to make is that, by the way, the presidents were Wu Chi-chu and Bala Maniam, whom some of you may know, but who did not become politically active after they graduated. Wu Chi-chu is still a lawyer. I became vice president in my second year, but my main contribution to the DSC was as its publication secretary. I was responsible for its bulletin, the Socialist Democrat, and also for Demos. And you can find them, these still in the Singapore-Malaysia collection, and from which I'm sorry to say KU selected quotes which made us look very foolish. But they were, when I went back to it, so I decided yesterday and spent 2 hours looking through the old issues to remind me. I said, my God, did you write those brilliant articles? Right, anyway, the thing is that the Socialist Club was on the decline, and he said that I falsely made allegations that they were mostly middle class, right? But his own account showed that they were middle class. He himself came from one of the leading goldsmith families in Singapore, and he's